And we start by wishing everyone a happy Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day to mothers everywhere. To all who are listening, who are mothers, we appreciate everything that you have done in your life, in this divine office of motherhood. And what we want to do today, what we want to come together, and I can't believe a year's gone by already since last Mother's Day, because this is one of, I think, the most important topics for us to truly understand and to truly practice on our spiritual path, and that is unconditional love. So we want to start by recognizing that there is the idealistic way that something is, and then there is the practical way that it is. And hardly anything on this plane of existence reaches its true potential. That's what we're here for. We're here to grow into that potential. So I think the poet said, if a man's reach does not exceed his grasp, then what's a heaven for? Right? There's always this ideal that we're moving toward. There's always this something that we can expand into. Remember, we talked a few weeks ago about the universe constantly expanding, and our consciousness is constantly expanding. We're constantly growing. And I say this because sometimes when we get into Mother's Day, and I've seen it a little bit in some of the posts already this morning on Facebook, it's a tough time for people. It is a tough time. For some, our mothers are gone. They've passed before us, and we miss them, and we miss them dearly. For others, they may never have gotten to know their mothers, and they wonder, what is that experience? What could that experience? What is the potential that experience was like? And for still others, they had the experience, but it wasn't a good one. It was stressful. It may have been abusive. It may have been full of all kinds of human faults. And it's very hard. It's very hard for people, especially if you've grown up in a situation like that, when everybody's talking about how wonderful mother's love is. It's very hard for people to say, well, but you don't know where I've been. So what we want to keep that in mind today. We don't want to dishonor anyone. We don't want to disavow the experience that anyone has had. But what we want to do is we want to move beyond whatever it may have been. And we want to step into the ideal of what unconditional love, what motherhood as a symbol of God's unconditional love is. And how you and I, today, regardless of what happened in the past, regardless of how old we are, regardless of our position in life at this time, how we can not only experience that unconditional love, but how we can express it, The ancients will tell us that there are three major paths to God, three yogas in the Eastern tradition. Right? There's the yoga of love, which is what we're talking about today. There's the yoga of knowledge, which is our studying, our reading, our listening to lectures. And there is the yoga of unconditional service. The yoga in the language, yoga means to yoke or to join together, which interestingly enough the word religion means. Religio means to bind together. So, as Joseph Campbell tells us, if we look across different cultures in different times, there's some primordial or fundamental ideas that bubble up through human consciousness. And these ideas get expressed in the costumes, in the culture, in the characters of that particular culture. And one of these ideas that bubbles up everywhere is that there is a need to bind together. And we have to say then, well, what is it that we are trying to bind together? And how do we bind this together? And this need of what it is that needs to be bound together is an overcoming of this idea of separation. What needs to be bound together is the human concept of us as being separated from, apart from, different than that which has created us out of itself. And so Dr. Holmes tells us there's really only one problem to resolve, and that is this idea of separation. See, somehow in theology and in religion, there's this barrier. There's this thing called God, which is way out there somewhere, far off in heaven, and then there is us, human beings, down here on earth, and there's this chasm between the two. Okay? And in olden times, in different ways of thinking, there needed to be intermediaries, messengers to go back and forth, saints, saviors, angels, beings that were capable of moving back and forth. But we're still stuck here, and divine love, or God, is still way up there. And that is what we need to bind together. We need to close that gap. We need to close that chasm. And we need to come to realize that the apparent separation is only in consciousness. It is only in thinking. It cannot be in reality. Again, some of the ideas that percolate up through human consciousness in different religions, in different cultures, in different times, is what is this thing that we call God? And we call it by many different names. You can call it the divine, you can call it love, you can call it nature, you can call it peace. It makes no difference to it what we call it, but it makes every bit of difference to us what we call it. Right? Because the word that we give, and the word is only a verbal representation of our concept, that concept that we hold of this thing that has created us out of itself, that determines our whole life. That determines our whole life. But over time and in different places, the deep thinkers and the mystics and the people who have had that personal experience of the activity and the presence of the divine will come to tell us three characteristics that we can use to describe the divine, and yet it is none of those, and yet it is all of those. Right? The great mystery. And those three characteristics are omniscience, all-knowing, omnipotence, all power, and omnipresence. Now, we could take that omnipresence and we could say, well, that means then that the divine is everywhere present, and that's one typical explanation. Or we could say that God is all presence. Whatever is present, all presence is the divine. So it's one thing to say, well, if God is everywhere, then God must be right where I am, even if I can't quite grasp that, even if I can't quite experience that. And it's another thing to say that God is present as me, through me. Not to say that I am God, but to say that this life that is expressing itself as Jim didn't create. Jim's parents didn't create. My mother didn't create. My father didn't create. This life is an expression of some other presence, the omnipresence. So we kind of grapple with these ideas, see, because our human intellect, as I said a few weeks ago, our human intellect can't get around. We can talk about infinity, but we sure don't know what it is. I laugh, and I told you this when we were studying mathematics in high school, and they talked about the different levels of infinity. And I wrote a satire paper for my math instructor on it. That infinity means that it's so big we can't count there, and then there's the second level infinity, which is even bigger. Right? And the problem they have, of course, is no matter how far you count, you can always add one to it. You're never done. We don't understand that. We can't grasp that. We might be able to experience it from time to time. We might have glimpses of it. We might have the mystical experience or the experience of cosmic consciousness. but the intellect just can't quite go there. So what we are trying to do, what we are trying to bind together is this gap in our consciousness, this gap in our intellect that somehow believes in separation that in reality cannot be. It cannot be. If God is all there is, and God is the only presence that there is, God is everywhere present and everywhere presence, then there can be no gap. There can be a perceived gap. There can be an idea of a gap. But in reality, there is no gap. So in Buddhism, we get a beautiful example. I was listening to a lecture, and it was an American Buddhist was speaking. He was speaking to a group in America. And I think he was in California, and he said, "Suppose you're in Oakland, and you look across the bay and you see San Francisco, and you think, well, I need to go from Oakland to San Francisco. I want to go over there. I want to experience San Francisco. I want to see what's over there." So you might build a raft. You might go and find some logs, and you might find some vines, and you might bind them all together. You might make this beautiful raft, and then you might fashion a couple of paddles or some poles to push along, depending on how deep the water is. And then you move across. You move across the bay. And then you arrive at San Francisco, and you are there. Now, the first thing is that you wouldn't pick up that raft and carry it with you. I mean, you wouldn't carry it with you and say to everybody, "Look at this beautiful raft I built, and I paddled it across the bay." You're done with the raft. You don't need the raft anymore. You're in San Francisco. And the second thing is what they tell us is now you turn around and you look back to Oakland, and you suddenly realize that there is no bay. There never was a bay. And that you are in fact right where you were when you started. But you are having a different experience. You are having a different experience. So they use this example to kind of illustrate spiritual growth to us. So we start our journey and we think that there's this gap, and religion and yoga and things that bind us together, things that close that gap, they're like the raft to us. They're like the tools that we use to get across this gap. But once we arrive, once we get at the other side, once we have the experience of the unity from the other side, we realize that there never was a gap. There just appeared to be a gap. So the three paths, the three yogas, the yoga of love, the yoga of service, and the yoga of knowledge, these are rafts, these are tools, these are practices that you and I use in order to close that gap, in order to erase the illusion of the separation. So I want you to hold that thought for just a moment, and I'm just going to switch to another one, and then we'll come back and kind of hopefully pull them together. One thing that helps me in life and in growth is to consider the things that we see here on earth as kind of symbols of something beyond, something deeper. So it's kind of like if we stop and look at everything, nothing is as it seems, but everything is, if we will pay attention, everything is pointing us to something else, to something deeper. There's a movie called Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. I think Bernardo Bertolucci made it, and it is about Francis of Assisi. And there's a every drama, every movie that we make has drama. I mean, unless it's a comedy, and comedies have a different kind of drama. But in film and in storytelling, everything has to have a struggle. That's what keeps people paying attention. unfortunately, And in this movie, the struggle was that this young man, Francis, started to have this awakening, started to have this spiritual awakening. And in so doing, he stepped away from his father's wealth. His father was a wealthy merchant, and there's a dramatic scene in the movie where he goes out into the town square and he takes off all of his clothes because his father bought them from him. And he walks naked off into the countryside to begin his new spiritual life. Very symbolic, kind of like all of us being born. We come into this world and we're starting this new adventure. And as Francis goes off and as he's starting to teach people about the love of God, about this unconditional love of God that we're talking about today, it raises some concern amongst the establishment, So they try to have him shut down. They file a complaint, and they try to have him shut down. And Francis is summoned to Rome. The big dramatic moment of the movie. He's summoned to Rome, and he has to go before the Pope. And is the Pope going to give him a cease and desist order? What is going to happen here? And the scene that the filmmaker put in, I have no idea whether it's historically true or not, but the dramatic scene that the filmmaker put in, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember it exactly, but the Pope says to Francis, he says, God speaks to us in many ways, and you have been blessed to hear the sermon in the stones, to experience the presence of God in nature. Go back out and teach other people how to do it. So my point is that the water flowing in the stream, the air that we breathe, the sunlight that grows our food, the way that the stars and the planets stay in place, the mystery by which birds navigate for thousands of miles and whales swim from pole to pole without charts, without compass, without GPS. All of these things tell us that there's a harmony in life. How do the birds and the bees know to work together? How did that happen? And we can say from evolution, it came about because it was a necessity, right? But what is behind evolution? Right? Remember, evolution is the unfoldment of consciousness. It is not the cause of consciousness. It is the unfoldment. By the way, I read a fascinating article on the web this week about an island somewhere where the same species of bird went extinct and evolved back into existence and went extinct and evolved back into existence like 2 or 3 times. And I haven't quite put my mind around that yet. How amazing is this thing called life, How wonderful is this thing called life? When we start to look at that, then we start to realize, as Dr. Holmes told us, if we see an engine, there is an engineer. There's someone who designed it. There's someone who built it. And what this means to me, what this comes back to me, where I'm trying to get back to, is this love, this unconditional love that we're talking about today. That motherhood is a symbol of that love. That probably in the office of motherhood, in the role of motherhood, we see that unconditional love, we experience that unconditional love, we feel that unconditional love more than in any other place in life. Whether it be in our own lives with our own mothers, or just looking at life, just looking at mothers and children, whether they be human or whether they be animals. You see the pictures people post on the internet of an animal raising the young of another species. There's some instinct, the instinct of mother, this instinct of nurturing, this instinct of helping this creature to grow. There's something that transcends even the species, right? This is the unconditional love. This is the unconditional love I'm talking about. So I invite you this morning to think of, as we're celebrating motherhood, as we're celebrating our mothers, what we're celebrating is love. We're celebrating this unconditional love. And if love is one of the three main paths to join us together, to bind us together, to yoke us together with God, and remember, the idea of separation is only an idea. It cannot be a fact. It cannot be a reality. Then how does this practice of love, how does this practice of unconditional love bind us together? And mind you, if you think about motherhood, and you think about what mothers do, they walk all three paths at the same time. You know, unconditionally serve their family, unconditionally take care of their children, you know, unconditionally love their children, and nurture the minds of their children, teach their children. Many years ago, I was in a grocery store. I can still see the image in my mind's eye. I can still see the faces. But Lori had sent me to the store for something. And as most grocery stores, when you go in, the first place you hit is the produce department. I think there's a reason for that, but nevertheless, hit the produce department. And just as I got there, there was a young mother with a toddler, you know, maybe two, a little guy about 2 years old, you know. And she had her grocery list out, and she had him sitting in that little seat in the back of the grocery buggy. She had her purse down in the basket, and she was starting to push through the produce section. And this little guy, he had a million questions, you know. Mommy, what's this? Mommy, what's that? Mommy, who's that over there? Mommy, what's that over there? And she kindly and lovingly answered every question. Mommy, what is this? Well, that's an orange, sweetie. An orange? She says, yes, you remember oranges. We had an orange yesterday. Remember, you ate it and you said it was yummy. Oh, yeah, an orange. You could see the little wheels turning now, you know. So she was reinforcing this idea, helping him to remember what an orange was. The next thing, what is that, Mommy? Well, that's an apple. Do you like apples? And he'd think a little bit. Oh, yeah, yes, I do. I think I do like apples, yes, yeah. You know, Mommy cuts it open for you so it's easier for you to eat in slices, so it doesn't look exactly like it does. Oh, yeah. Kindly, lovingly educating this little guy with everything appropriate for the moment, but helping him to learn the things that he needed to learn as he went through life. So in this office of motherhood, in this expression of unconditional love as motherhood, we see selfless service. We see unconditional love. Okay? We see the path of knowledge. With regard to unconditional love, I'll mention something I know I've shared before, but it just was so powerful when I saw it. When I was back in Durham, Lori and I were back there in the 90s, we had a prison ministry, and we would go off into a prison camp and teach classes, and you know, had a study group and those sorts of things. And I became very interested in prisons, prison ministry, and all those sorts of things. And there was a program on about prisons in North Carolina. And in North Carolina, there's a big prison farm down in the eastern part of the state. I think it's called Caledonia. And that is where inmates raise most of the food for all of the other inmates in all of the other correctional institutions in the state. So it's like a big farm, you know, but the people who are there are prisoners. And whoever was doing the show went and interviewed this man, and this man was serving a life term. He acted as if he had no possibility of ever getting out of there, you know. And he said, you know, I'm here, and I deserve to be here. This is his words. He said, I'm guilty of the crime for which I was convicted. I did those things, and they were terrible things. So I understand that I have to be here for the rest of my life. I understand that I have to work on this farm for the rest of my life. He says, and I can live with that. I can deal with that. He says, but the one thing that they never tell you, the one thing that nobody ever thinks of when they go out and do their crime, is that when you go to prison, you take your mother with you. He says, and that is the biggest regret that I have. He says, after a while, your wife will divorce you so she can move on with her life. He says, after a while, your kids will stop writing to you as they move on with their lives. He says, but every year on my birthday, I get a card from my mother, and it breaks my heart. Unconditional love. He was her little boy. No matter what he did, no matter where he was, she still loved him. She still loved him. So this unconditional love then that we're talking about, this is the love of God that comes into expression in our lives in many different ways, through many different people. But one of the primary experiences is through our mothers, through mothers everywhere, through this office of motherhood, through this experience of motherhood. And what it shows us is that this divine love that has created us out of itself loves us unconditionally. Like the mom who would not forget her son in prison. Divine love can't let us go, won't let us go, because we are part of it. We are some part of it. It has created us out of itself. It has left us alone to make this magnificent discovery. And in making that discovery, we have made mistakes, and we probably will make more. I don't think any of us has ever lived up to the best that we know, because we have to grow into it. See, that's the vision that we're growing into. But we've been doing the best we could with our level of understanding, with our level of emotional maturity, with the resources we had available to us. Now, sometimes it's hard to look at that. We look at that and say, oh my God, that was a terrible thing. How could somebody not know that that was a terrible thing to do? And they may in fact have known it was a terrible thing to do. But it's quite possible they just couldn't do any better. So we learn then to forgive. We learn then to accept that human beings, we as human beings, don't always do the best we can do. But we can still love one another. You see, we can still love one another during the process. We recognize that because divine love has created us out of itself, it too accepts us as we are and loves us as we are and just encourages us to grow, to become more, to do more, to express its life more fully. So the image that I would like to create, the image I would like us to have, is to think of this. We say, why is, the fundamental problem of theology, right? The problem of evil. If God is so good, why do terrible things happen? And what I'd like you to think about is, think about Easter. We were talking about the chicken inside the eggshell, right? The little chick as it grows inside the eggshell. The eggshell was the perfect environment for that chick to grow in at that time, at that stage of its development. Everything that chick needed was present for it in the yolk of the egg. All of the nutrition was there. There was even air can kind of get through the shell by osmosis. A little bit of light can get through there so the eyes can develop. And everything for the development of that chick was perfect inside that shell. But the shell served as a barrier. And if the chicken stayed inside that shell too long, problems would arise. There came a time where it had to break out. And life provided it with an egg tooth, perfect for pecking open the shell. And the timing of that, the timing of that is most important. It was decided by the chick. It was decided by something in the chick. You know? You can imagine you and I, if we were chicken farmers and we had all of these eggs, you know, and we had them under lights and we were incubating them, and we had, you know, we put numbers on each one so we would know where they came from, who the mother was, and all these different things that human beings try to control that which works of its own accord anyway. And we might say, well, this one, it should have hatched yesterday, you know. Let's go break it open. And of course, in so doing, we would destroy it because it wasn't its time. It wasn't ready. In the East, they answer the question of if God is so good, why do human beings suffer? Why don't we know our unity with God? Why don't we know our oneness with God? And they answer that by saying that mankind has had ignorance heaped upon it. Ignorance heaped upon it. And then the gentleman who taught us that, he was an old teacher of Hindu philosophy out at Chapel Hill. He chuckled and he says, and then of course the next question is, who heaped the ignorance and why? Who heaped the ignorance and why? But just think about that image for a minute. Think of, instead of a shell, think of our consciousness, your consciousness and my consciousness, as being encased in mud, in ignorance. Race consciousness. Joel Goldsmith tells us, never try to accept personal responsibility for evil. Though, you know, if something happens, don't say, well, why did I do this, or why did I do that, or why did this happen to me? He said, just recognize that we are all kind of sullied in the mud of race consciousness, and the solution is to get out of the mud. Get out of the mud. Remove the barrier of separation, this illusion of the mud that I'm talking about, and peck our way out. So while we are living in this illusion of separation from the presence of God, we are developing, just like the chick develops in the egg, we are developing our own unique personality. We are developing our own worldview. And of course, it's not really entirely ours, right? Because we are part of the whole. The whole is seeing uniquely as us and through us. And this idea of, as long as there's this idea of separation, we think, well, I this and I that and the other thing. And as we start to move away from that, we can say, well, it as me. And then eventually we can move away from the as me to it, right? So the beginning stages of life, God is doing it to me. And then we might say that God is doing it through me or as me. And then finally we just say that God is. God is. God is. So what we want to do, the picture I hope works for us is that we are, each of us, kind of encased in this race consciousness. We are encased in this human consciousness of mud. We are encased in this shell that we have to eventually break our way out of it. And love is one of the key tools. In fact, if we didn't do anything else for our whole life, if we didn't do anything else but focus on learning how to love unconditionally, learning how to receive unconditional love, learning how to express unconditional love, if that was the only thing that we ever did, that would be enough. That would be enough. In his essay on the love of God, Augustine has a famous quote, and he says, finally, we have one commandment. Love and do what you will. Love and do what you will. We say, how can that be? How can we say love and do what you will? Because people will do all kinds of terrible things. Love first, and then do what you will. He who knows not love knows not God. All of these kind of different ways of putting it. So what we want to do, what we want to come to in terms of our own spiritual practice, we can think, well, maybe I didn't get the unconditional love that I felt that I wanted, and that's true. That may be true for some of us. We didn't get that. But can you give it? Can you give it now? Can you experience it now in the givingness of it? Not in the gettingness of it, but in the givingness of it. Can you find a way to experience it and share what you have? The Wednesday night group, we're reading a book by Thich Nhat Hanh. The particular book is called The Miracle of Mindfulness. But there was a show or a tape that we had at the center. I'm not sure which it was, but it was about some of the work that Thich Nhat Hanh was doing with Vietnam veterans, American Vietnam veterans in the United States. And you have to think about how remarkable this is, because Thich Nhat Hanh was a Vietnamese monk, and he was living in Vietnam at the time the war was going on. And he tried to develop teachers who would go into the villages and just teach people how to love. Not to be politically active, not to take one side or the other, but just to teach them how to be good people. And of course they came under persecution. I don't know from which side or sides, but those teachers themselves became under persecution because different factions wanted the villagers to join their side. But Thich Nhat Hanh was there at the time that this war was going on, at the time that the atrocities of war were going on. And in later years he worked with American veterans who were suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome, from guilt from what they had seen and what they had done. And he held retreats I think it was up in Vermont somewhere. He held retreats where these veterans could come for a few days of spiritual practice and spiritual growth and lectures, and kind of, through education, through practice, start to heal. And the program profiled this one man who was very aloof. He did not want to participate too much in the group activities. He didn't want too much to talk to anybody. He kind of stayed by himself, and and the way that he was portrayed in the film, it was obvious that he was very troubled. He was very troubled about something. And Thich Nhat Hanh got with him one-on-one, and was able to find out what it was that was bothering this man. And what he had been carrying around for all of these years was this tremendous sense of guilt of what he had done in the war. His outfit had been in a firefight, and he saw some movement in the bushes, and he fired into the bushes, and the movement stopped. And he assumed he had killed enemy soldiers. And after it was all over, he went and he looked, and he had killed 4 little girls. And he couldn't live with himself. So Thich Nhat Hanh said to him, "You can't change that. And that was in the past. It was regrettable, but it happened." He said, "What you can do now is you can find a way to give." He said, "Right now, in this country, there are 4 little girls somewhere who need your help. Let's find them. Let's help them." And I'm tearing up because it was so powerful. He had to learn to give. He had to learn to give. He had to open himself up as a channel of giving love before he could experience love. Unconditional love, unconditional love is the quickest path to God. And each and every one of us, regardless of what our experiences may have been in the past, each and every one of us can find a way right now to open ourselves up to be that instrument of unconditional love. And the first person we have to learn to love unconditionally is our own self. And just like this man, he had to learn to love in spite of what he had done, in spite of the guilt that he had carried around. By learning to love, by learning to give, by learning to be that instrument of love, that started to wash away. Can you love yourself unconditionally? Can you love yourself completely? Can you recognize that you are the living expression of divine love? Can you look in the mirror and love yourself as God loves you? That is your spiritual practice. Then can you take that love and can you share it without condition? Just share it. Find somewhere, find some way, find someone, find something. Find something that you can participate in financially, through tithing, through activity, through volunteering. Find some way that you can look at something and say, this is God's unconditional love in action in this world right here and right now, and I am part of it. In doing this, we break out of the barrier of ignorance. We break through the wall of the muddiness of race consciousness that says we are separated from one another. We are apart from one another. We are different from one another. We are here to use each other to get what we want, whatever that may be, whether it be to use each other to get rich or to boost our egos or whatever other things that people do to one another. We're not here for any of those things that race consciousness tells us. We are here to walk the path of love, the path of service, and the path of knowledge, which are really the same path experienced at 3 different times in our lives. We are here to learn that the divine loves us unconditionally. And the best way for us to do that is to learn how to love unconditionally. So somewhere right now, somewhere there is someone in this world who's feeling bad today because they didn't get that unconditional love they felt they should have gotten as they were growing up. And you and I can be an instrument of that love. Somewhere there are people suffering. Somewhere there are people in prison. Somewhere there are people who just need someone to reach out to them and say, you know what, you're okay. You're okay. I love you just the way you are. So I invite you this week to take these ideas into your heart. Not let them get out of your head and let them get into your heart. Right? As we used to say in class, that's the longest 18 inches in the world. getting something from your head to your heart. Catch yourself if you have any ideas of separation. Excuse me. Catch yourself. Cancel, replace. Cancel, replace. Right? You know what I mean by that? When something comes up that's not true, you say, "Oh, that's not true." Cancel that and replace that with love. Find a way to let unconditional love express through you. Do what you can to do that. Find an organization somewhere that you can look at and you can say, "Oh my goodness, that represents unconditional love. I wish to support it." And find a way to support it, financially or through service. I think the most important thing to consider is that this is our purpose. This is the reason that we are here, is to learn how to erase that barrier of separation. And love is the surest and the quickest, not necessarily the easiest, but the surest and the quickest way. Start where it's easy, right? There are people, there are pets, there are organizations, there are things that it's going to be very easy for you to love. And start there. And occasionally look at what is it that is so difficult for you to love. And whatever that is, can you find a way to love it? Can you find a way to see the presence and the activity of God in that person or in that situation? As crazy as it may look. Find the love. It can be a very joyful life if we make a game out of finding love. Finding love everywhere. Finding love expressing itself everywhere. And finding love expressing itself through us, as us. As we do so, the muddiness of human consciousness washes off of us. We break out of the shell that we've been encapsulated in. We step out of the illusions that the human race so firmly believes in. And we start to experience the unconditional love. That experience of the unconditional love is the experience of the activity and the presence of God. Eventually we'll be able to look in the mirror and instead of saying, "I love myself as God loves me," to simply say, "God loves. Everything else is an illusion." And so it is.